Shut up and sit down.
Hi guys, I'm Dodge, this is Big Mech's Workshop and Paint Studio, and today I'm painting a weird boy, Shaman from Fantasy. I'm going to paint him in the fashion of the Snakebites on 40k, mainly because I needed to do a Snakebite video and I've already done 3 knobs and I needed to change it up a bit. This guy's a really interesting character, so I thought we'll paint him up, we'll do him in some tribal patterns and we'll make him look a bit like a Snakebite, and then I've got videos for 40k and for the Age of Sigmar, seeing as we haven't done one in a while. So I started off with a Vallejo black primer. It's what we usually use in the studio for priming most things. And the next colour, or the colour for the skin, is going to be yellow olive by Model Colour. We're going to use that to start doing the skin, because you want to get under the cloak first. You want to get most of that finished, that way we're not bouncing our brush around and possibly ruining work that we've already done previously. Now the highlight for this is another Model Colour paint, and it's a camo olive green. It's a very subtle highlight. We do quite a bit on this skin, so what you want to be doing as I'm using a wet palette is rubbing off most of the paint from the brush and pulling from the recesses to the raised areas, and that's basically all glazing is. There's barely anything on that brush, and we're just going to pull from the from the shaded area up to the top, and we're going to do lots and lots of layers of this. After that I'm going to switch to a Games Workshop paint and use Strachan Green, which is more of a yellowy green, going for a more fantasy goblin skin on this one, as I've had to do 4 different orc skins for these past videos. And again, we're using that same technique, but as you can see, that's slowly building up the colour transition there, rather than just whacking it on and throwing a wash on. You just want to take your time with this, because orc skin's a main feature of the orcs, as they're the only guys that are green, so you want it to look nice. And this is the same colour. I've just put a transition in there. I just wanted to show you it building up, because I obviously can't show you the whole length, even though I sped up the video. You know, I can't show you the whole process because it takes too long, so I've just skipped forward a bit to show you that particular colour building up, so you can see how that works. Now the next colour, really watered down, Steel Legion Drab by Games Workshop. And this is how watered down my paint is when I'm doing the skin as well. I left this bit in like this to show you exactly how watered down it is. And if you keep your paint wet enough and keep pulling those layers down, you'll be able to keep complete control of it. And even if you make a mistake, the paint's so thin, you just do a couple more layers over the top and put that highlight or that colour exactly where you want it to be. After many layers of that, we're going to use Sandstone by Model Colour, and we're going to start following all the grooves. But you don't just have to follow the grooves on this, because we're putting in a lot of washes, so you can literally just colour the top half all the way up. Starting again from the point where I want the least amount of paint, and it sounds kind of obvious, but you want to pull the paint to where you want the most paint, because that's how the brush works, stays on the brush that way, and you want most of it at the top. So you want to do a bit of the top in the grooves, but the grooves at the bottom you don't really want to fill those in. And again, here's that transition. It's going to show you how that layer and those colours start to build up. It does take a lot of time to do this, but with characters and certain things, you want to take your time doing them. If you're doing a 40k army with loads of boys in it, don't bother doing this. Get an airbrush and just do it that way. It'll be a lot quicker. But at the studio, we understand not everyone's got an airbrush, so we like to do some stuff with a brush as well. Now we're going to use an army paint, a strong tone, and some medium. The first bit of this wash is going to be put into all the recesses, and then as it's drying we're going to go back over the whole thing. That way all the recesses are getting 2 layers of the same sort of colour, and there's no hard lines where the paint is blended. Obviously I've put in a bunch of medium into this. It's Lamiate Medium by Games Workshop. It just stops it drying up that little bit more cloudy. After that I decided while that's drying I'm going to do a wash of Biletan Green mixed with Druchii Violet, and just water this time. As the skin can be can look kind of dry and harsh as it's an orc. It's completely up to you the ratios that you're going to mix the Biletan and Druchii Violet, but this is just going to give a more earthy brown tone to the skin, and we're going to build it back up again later on. Next is me trying something I don't usually do, but I did say we were going to do tribal patterns on this guy. So I'm using the black primer again, because I find like can get a nice control over that, and even if it's a bit blotchy when it goes on, it tends to dry really flat to the surface because it's a primer. I'm using a Winsor Newton Series 7 here, and I'm basically using I'm still using my wet palette, and I'm slowly building lines all the way around that. The only tricky part, besides keeping this straight, is figuring out which way the line would go with the folds. But if you take your time doing this, you can build that up. You want to run 2 parallel lines and then fill that in, rather than build up from the middle. As you can see, I've started filling that in there with an extra line, thickening it up a bit, because we're going to do some strips in the centre. Also, I've just noticed my notes, don't hold your breath while doing this. It's a habit people do when they're concentrating on a bit of a model that's really difficult to do. If you hold your breath, there's no oxygen going to your brain, your hand will shake more and it will make it harder to do. So what you want to be doing is learning to breathe while you're doing intricate details, and stop the habit of holding your breath when you're concentrating really, really hard and painting. Now, you may have seen on one of our other Ork videos, the best way to paint over black with a light colour is to just use a brown, and in this case I'm using Morning Fang Brown by Games Workshop, because I'm wanting to do some orange stripes down the sides of this. Sticking with some tribal colours, trying to make them a bit earthy, but a bit vibrant, because it's a weird boy, or shaman even. I'm not up on my Age of Sigmar stuff, guys, so if you're watching this, thanks for watching, but Age of Sigmar is not something I know much about. And then we're going to use Troll Slayer Orange by Games Workshop, and we're going to use the same techniques we've been using on everything else, and we're going to start bringing this from the recesses to all those raised curves. All the folds, you want to make sure they've got a good layer of this on. Take your time with this, try and stay in between those lines. If you go over, it doesn't matter, we can fix that up. And the reason this colour is so vibrant is because we're going to add a lot of washes to all of this, so we want to start with a more vibrant colour, so when it's washed down it's not too muted. Now I'm going to use Brown Sand by Model Colour and start picking up that cloak even further, because at this point I've got a good eye for where I'm going with this thing. Again, focus now pretty much just on the top quarter of the model. Those washes have helped blend all those colours together. We've got a nice transition going on the cloak, and you can see where it looks like the light's hitting, and they're all nice and pronounced at this point. Then we're going to go to Sand Yellow by Model Air, which is a bit more of a pale yellow than the previous one, but it seems to work quite well for this. Again, we're just bringing that up to the top quarter, maybe the last eighth of the cloak. But because the paint's so thin, you'll always be able to see, well, for most part you'll be able to see the build up from the underneath and your other transitions. And this is just a transition showing you that colour like building up over time, showing you the result. And as I said, it takes a long time to do these, but it's worth doing. After that, it's Agrax Earthshade and Medium, and this is 50-50. Again, I'm starting most of my brushwork at the bottom half and pulling that down into the recesses. And we are going over the orange strips with this as well. That's going to help blend those orange lines so they look like they also flow with the rest of the cloak. Now we're going back to the Troll Slayer Orange because we've toned it right down with a Agrax Earthshade. But at this point you're going to be doing about a quarter, 2/3 of the colour you did before, leaving some of that shaded Troll Slayer Orange in the underneath. Especially in those folds. If the fold's really deep, like the one there on the right, you don't really need to go in there. I just leave it that colour, it'll really add to the depth of the model. And see, I'm just skipping that bit and doing the other part. Now I decided, as it's snake bites, I was going to try my hand at some more freehand work and do a snakebite logo, which is quite difficult when you first start doing it, but then I realised all I really needed to do is paint a rectangle. That's the first thing you do. So ignore that tail that I've put on there. Just do a rectangle, then add a tail and a head to it. You can break it up later for the logo with the blacks. And again, I've used Morning Fang Brown there to go over the black once I've put that on. And then I'm using Cold Grey by Model Colour. This will be several coats as well, even though it looks quite thick. It's just more vibrant than you'd expect because it's going on a brown rather than on the black, which will save you a lot of layers and a lot of steps. Now we're back to the Sand Yellow by Model Air, as we've had a wash recently, and we're going to bring up those folds again. We'll be doing this quite a bit, but eventually we'll stop using the sand yellow and start adding an extra colour into that to really make it pop. Now I'm going to go over the folds that the Snakebite logo goes over, and I'm going to use Sky Grey by Model Colour. And using the same glazing techniques, just pulling those up so they match up where the rest of the highlights are. It's really important that you match up all the different highlights in the right places while doing this. It's a bit awkward to see on camera as the colours are quite bright and I've got a white background and the light's shining on it, but I'm hoping you can pick that out there. It's best to do it this way and then put the black lines in to detail it up rather than trying to do it after the black lines. Now we're going to switch to Fire Dragon Bright by Games Workshop, and we're really starting to bring out those oranges. It may seem like a bit much, but again, we're going to keep adding washes to this and toning it down. As you can tell, this has had a lot of layers on it, a lot of time has been spent on the cloak, but it's a main feature of this model. And you can really see those oranges in those hot spots really picking up at this point. Next, I'm sure you can guess what I'm going to do. Agrax Earthshade and medium, like apparently loads of medium according to my notes, so this is more like 70% medium, as I only want to tone down those recessed bits with the orange and the folds, so I don't really want it to have a hard line against anything else. So to do that I've just watered it down loads, so there's no hard line, and the brush should pull all that into the recesses and the places I want it. And here we are again with the sand yellow, but this is the last time we're going to use sand yellow on its own. The reason you put so many washes on with these glazes, or at least I did, is because I wasn't happy with some of the glazing results. They weren't smooth where I wanted them to be. So if you're not happy with it, you just add more layers, do another wash to blend it together, and add more layers. But at this point this cloak's looking very three-dimensional, and all the colours and highlights are in the right place. Now, Sand Yellow and Moonray Flesh by Scale 75 was mixed, and that's to really bring up the final sort of highlights here. At this point you want to be highlighting the bottom parts as well, that flail up, just to make sure they look like they're catching the light as well. And the reason I've used the Moonray Flesh, which is a really pale colour, is I wanted the cloak to look like it's muted rather than glowing, which is a problem some people have with highlights, is they will they'll add a highlight but it'll just be a brighter colour. Now we're going to use Moonray Flesh on its own by Scale 75. Just picking up certain highlights at this point, you don't need to do the whole thing. Just picking out some hot spots that will catch the eye and make the model look interesting. Now all I'm doing is trying to go over this with a black line and a Winsor Newton. See if you've made your oranges a bit thick, now you can start adding that black line back in. And if you make a mistake, just get another brush and some water and try and rub that out. And this is where everything went wrong. I was trying to put little orange triangles for the whole thing, that was my original plan, and the lines I did for the triangle to make the triangles weren't straight enough, and they ended up being too thick to the point where you can't really see that orange pattern that we've been working on. Yeah, for you this will be instant, but I will take a break and there'll be an advert and we'll come back and see if I can actually fix this. Okay, so we're back. I've painted the bone here in Morning Fang Brown, and now we're going to use Xandri Dust by Games Workshop to pick that out. And at this point I was still trying to figure out how I'm going to salvage this strip that clearly took a fair few hours. My skills aren't quite good enough to make little tiny orange triangles apparently, but a bit of practice and I'll get better at that. Again, the Xandri Dust is just glazed up all over these skulls, and we're going to do all the skulls in Xandri Dust. And ta-da! There you go, I managed to fix that up. I redid all the orange, I thickened the line by going over it all with black primer, and decided to put an extra blue line in just to make it more interesting. So the blue line was done with dark Prussian blue for the blue strip, and then I added Jolden Turquoise by Scale 75. and that's what I'm going to do the first highlight on those with. We're going to do pretty much the same technique that we did with the orange. Now we're going to add a blue shade by Game Colour. It's a blue shade wash. They actually have a really interesting range of washes. You should check those out, guys. Same as Army Painter. It gets a bit repetitive if you just keep using Games Workshop brands of washes, and they haven't got the biggest variety, so it's best to get some from some other suppliers as well. You'll find some interesting shades to work with. Obviously we've washed that blue right down, so we're going to bring up the next half of that highlight with the drilled in turquoise scale 75 paint again. So we start off by basically covering most of it, except for a bit of the Prussian blue, washing it down, then half of it with the same colour. And that's basically the pattern you're going to follow to get most highlights to look quite vibrant. Next up is Hero Blue by scale 75, and this is the top quarter of these folds, and as you can see, the orange pattern, the robe and the blue pattern, all the highlights are blending in together now. It's a very small work surface, but like I said, you can neaten those black lines up quite well. I'm kind of glad I went for this idea. I was going to put this pattern on some of the skulls as well, but time didn't allow it. Then we're going to use Blue Shade by Game Colour again. So we're just bringing it up, bringing it down, and if you're careful with where you place your washes, you obviously want to tone both parts, but you want most of your wash colour in the darkest recesses. And that's just achieved by pulling the brush to that direction from the area you want to wash or highlight. Now for all these skulls that we were doing, they don't quite stand out enough, but we're going to work with a Agrax Earth shade first. We're going to bring up all these skulls so they're much more white and ivory, so they'll stand out from the cloak and all the other muted colours that we've got on there. Just be careful you don't drip any of this while working on the skull onto any of your other work, because it'll really stand out. Now for the horns, I wanted to do something different for those, so there wasn't too much ivory. It's only a slight difference, it does show up a bit later on though, and it's a Dryad Bark by Games Workshop to start those off. I also did the staff, the bit that looks like a tree trunk or a branch. I did that in the Dryad Bark as well. Now I'm pretty much fixed on what type of colour palette I'm using, and I'm able to make some much better decisions. Now we're going to go back to highlighting up the skulls with Zandri Dust. Again, it's all glazing techniques here, so it's very very fine pigment on my paint, really watered down, so there's no brush strokes, no brush marks, and just bringing that up from the shade to the places where you want your highlights. And we're going to cover most of the skulls again now. Anything that's pronounced, that's going to get brought up. Just be sure you be careful which direction you're moving your brush. Then after that, we still need to brighten them up even further so they stand out, so we're going to use Games Workshop's Shabty Bone. Be careful when you're doing the skulls at the bottom that you don't sort of zone out and think to yourself, well that's the top of the skull, so that's where I'll put the highlight, because they're all at weird angles. So just take that into consideration, because it's easy to think that's the top, why, you know, you've been painting for hours. But now pay attention to which direction the skull is and just highlight the right part of it, the bit that's facing up. Then we're going to use Army Painter Strong Tone, really watered down, and drag that to the underneaths of everything, not to all the bone parts, sorry. As you can see, they're starting to stand out from the rest of the colours now. Even though they started off so similar, just changing a few colours in there, it's really changed the look. Now I'm just going to fill in the mouth with Tusker Fur. I love these heads that Games Workshop do with the two parts, with the mouths on the inside, on the body, and then you would connect the head. They look great, but they're so awkward to paint. There's always a bit at the back that you can't get to, so maybe sub-assembly this model. It's probably the safest thing to do, or the easiest even. Next, I'm going to use Cold Grey by Model Colour for the cloud effect, and we're going to try do something I don't do very often on this one. And you can take the technique I'm going to use on it as far as you want, for as much colour as you want. You want to make sure that paint's relatively thin, but because you're painting a grey over a white, you don't have to go too thin on this. I wouldn't really consider glazing that with a grey, because at this point the cold grey is going to allow some of those black bits to stick through and make it look patchy like smoke. Now ivory by model colour plus Ushabti bone is then used to start edge highlighting and bringing up the extreme highlights on all the bone work. This is the top of the nose, the brows, around the eye sockets, the teeth. And we're going to be quite generous with the amount of area we take up with this colour, because we really want these to stand out from everything else. Also the bird skull around his neck is done in these same colours. With all these other colours going on, and a lot of them being muted, I decided it was time to bring up the orc skin a little bit more than I previously anticipated, so I switched to Elysian Green by Games Workshop. And we're not going to do all the skin again, we're just going to do the top parts of all the skin, because the underneath colours are good. Anything that's shaded by the cloak can stay those muted sort of dark greens. Anything else that's sticking out, we're going to use Elysian Green and bring it up to more of a goblin sort of colour. Now we're going to add a little bit of Rhinox hide to the horns, because they've been left for a while. Bearing in mind I'm trying to make these horns look ever so slightly different to everything else because of this muted palette that we've got. And that's just started halfway up, pushed up to where the ropes are. Now we're going to glaze Carrick Stone all the way down. Don't worry about the little notches in these horns. I used to find these horns really intimidating and frustrating, but if you just glaze the whole thing down, leaving some of the Rhinox hide showing at the top, and then follow these other techniques, they'll actually stand out. All those little notches will stand out really well when we're done. So basically you're trying to get a nice smooth transition from top to bottom at this point. And while those were drying, I decided to work on these clouds a bit. So what this is game colour blue shade and game colour red shade in 2 shot glasses, and they are mixed with just plain water. Now they're really thin, as you can tell, and I'm going to start the red one at the base of the skull, and I'm going to start bringing that up. It's not going to make much of a difference visually at the moment, but what we're going to do is we're going to use that, we're going to cover, I would say 90%, but pretty much all of it for the first layer. We're going to cover the whole thing with that, but make sure the last bit you do is the top bit, because you want that wet, because now we're going to go in with the blue shade, mix that up on there, make sure you put enough blue shade on so it's nice and a decent strength to it, and blend that in, and they'll start to blend in the middle where your brush meets anyway, so you'll have this red to a purple to a blue sort of effect, but it's very subtle at the moment. And what we're going to do is 3 layers of this. Now we're going back to the Rhinox hide, but we're going to use it as a wash now, just to fix up that glazing we did, because we don't want any other colour in there. The glazing's going to be a bit patchy because of all those notches, so just water down your Rhinox hide to a wash consistency. Start about halfway up and start bringing that colour all the way back up to the top of the Rhinox hide. You can bring it to the underneaths of the tusks as well, that will add some more depth and shade. After the Rhinox hide wash, it is a Carrick Stone again. This time I'm using a Winsor & Newton, and I'm just gently stroking the raised areas in the midsection. The reason we're mainly focusing on the midsection is because that's where the transition begins, underneath the paints. So we want to start there, and you shouldn't really have to go too far down the tusk, and you don't really want to go all the way up it either. If you start in the middle, you can let your brush run out of paint by the time you get to the top, and that helps blend it out naturally anyway. After that, we're going to be using Rhinox hide, and just in case you've made any smudges, it's really watered down, we're going to start pushing that into the recesses. Same sort of technique, but we've done the top of the recesses, now we're going back in, it's nice and thin, so it should sit in those gaps. Now just to smooth all those out, we're going to use an Agrax Earthshade, which is rather watered down. Starting again from the bottom to midsection, bringing that all the way up, and as you can see, we've started to get this lovely transition where the shades change in the grooves and the highlights change in the grooves as well. And that's all there is to doing that type of horn. I will definitely be using this technique some more. Now Doombolt Brown was used by Games Workshop. This is going to be used for all the ropes. I thought it was vibrant enough, but it was still from the earthy sort of palette, so it would match once it was done. Sort of a reddish rope, which I thought fitted really well with the current style that we've got going on. Now I'd done 3 layers of both of those washes on here. Now it's time to use a Sky Grey by Model Colour. And this is sort of a glaze, but you can let it dry patchy as long as it doesn't look like a brush stroke. So you can be sort of a sloppy glaze here, just putting that where you want the highlight areas, and we're bringing out all the smoke clouds. You don't have to bring them all the way up to that colour. Like I said, it's smoke clouds, and the little bit of patchiness to them doesn't hurt. It actually helps them look more natural and more detailed. And while that's drying, I'm going back to the strings, and I'm going to use Red Leather by Model Colour as sort of an edge highlight for the whole thing, but at this point I'm just using it as an overbrush because it's a lot easier to overbrush, sort of like a dry brush, but your paint's a bit wetter over those because there's a lot of detail in those strings. Next is Harvester Flesh by Scale 75, and I'm going to use this to start highlighting the gums and the tongue. They didn't really get much work, mainly because it was very difficult to get into them. That was all that really needed with all the other colours that are going on, as long as you're gentle with the highlight and it's not too stark. I decided I'd start picking out some of the other details. I needed to pick out the teeth and the fingernails, so I just used Talon Sand by Games Workshop to start that off. Again, you want to be careful because these mouths for these particular models, they're pretty difficult, and it's easy to get paint where you don't want it. Now for the tree branch, I decided to mix Rhinox Hide and Gothor Brown. I do believe at some point I went over the Dryad Bark that was on there with Rhinox Hide. Now I'm mixing Rhinox Hide with Gothor Brown. Just a little bit of Gothor Brown to start off with, and we're going to highlight the majority of that. I finally decided it was time to start picking out these other bits on his cloak, so I used Dark Sea Green by Model Colour, which isn't actually that green at all. It's a bit of a greenish grey, but it does give a lovely stone effect. I wasn't sure what they were. They could have been pieces of metal, but I thought with the design I'll probably do them as stone. If I'd had more time to work on this model, I would have probably put red and orange. Actually, I was going to put white glyphs and symbols on the skin and on some other stuff, but I just didn't have time to do that for you guys. Maybe in another video. Now we're going to add a null oil wash to that whole lot, because they've got quite a few creases and cracks in these. They look like flint actually, or slate, so I wanted to put some dark wash on there to bring out those raised edges. I also used the null oil on the ropes and strings as well. Now I'm going to use Cold Grey by Model Colour, which we've been using quite a bit, but it ties in with the palette, and we're going to edge highlight all these stones and do a bit of freehand edge highlighting across the raised slate bits. This doesn't have to be too neat because we're going to wash it down again. Now we're going to add even more Gothor, so it's basically a bit of Rhinox Hide now in the Gothor Brown, and highlight a little bit less of the branch that holds the staff together. It's a colour I never use ever, Lamentus Yellow, but because we've done the bonework already on this bird skull, just a little touch, sort of a glaze of Lamentus Yellow just to tone it, letting all those shades we've already done show through. Give that beak a more warm, natural look. It just makes it stand out a little bit more and adds a little bit more detail. Now it's just straight Gothor on its own, just to pick out all those notches and bumps on the staff. It's a very interesting staff. I'll probably have to get another one of these kits and convert him to be a weird boy for my 40k army. Oh, I'll probably just use this one at the moment, but I definitely want to switch him up. Next I decided I'd start picking out that wristband that he's got, or bracelet, whatever it is, and I basically kept that really simple. I used a brass scorpion for it. I thought brass would be quite fitting, trying to keep the colours really native and primitive, so I didn't think bright golds or anything would work. I wanted some kind of cheaper metal. And as we mentioned, cheaper metals, lead belcher is used for his sword. I could have done it as the stone, but I thought it needed to stand out from everything else, so I basically just painted that one lead belcher. Again, pretty thin coats, may as well at this point, you've spent enough time on it. Off camera, I did a 4th layer of those 2 washes, and as you can see, you're really starting to get that transition now between the blues, the reds and the purples, and you can take that up as far as you want. I'd possibly, thinking about it, add some extra dark red into that, keep building that red up, or switch it slightly for a cowbird crimson, just to add some more depth to the inside of the skull. Now I'm using Skorax Bronze by Games Workshop, just to highlight the brass scorpion, and I didn't really need to do much else on there. I did leave it a little patchy, but without brush strokes in it, so it sort of looked dinted and chipped. I covered the majority of what you could see, leaving the brass scorpion in the recesses. And of course, since we've highlighted all these stone bits, it's time to tone those down with null oil, including over the edges. And that's really going to pull all those together, make the darkest areas in them really dark and the lighter ones quite vibrant, but not too vibrant that they look cartoonish. Now I decided that the teeth and the claws needed their highlight at this point. Also, I was getting very tired of this model at this point, and I know this has been a very long video, guys. Beige by Model Colour, and what we're doing here is adding little semicircles to the tops of all the fingernails and toes, just to make them look a bit more like toenails and fingernails. We're also going to use the same colour to highlight the tusks and teeth. Now, one of the last parts I needed to do was to get these leather pouches done and the leather straps around his waist, so I used Morning Fang Brown because it's already on the palette, but we're going to take it a bit of a different direction. I obviously couldn't use a really muted leather colour because we've got the bones on there. There's loads of different types of bone colours, and the Steel Legion drab, so I went for a Morning Fang Brown to make sort of a rich leather. Then I'm going to highlight those just using XV88 by Games Workshop. A very simple step this. It wasn't the neatest either. Just be really careful while you're working inside there not to pull your brush back when you're done and get a big splodge of paint where you don't want it. After that, it's an Agrax Earthshade wash, which I do on all the toenails and the tusks and the fingernails, but I also do on the leather pouch. It's really watered down because you just want it to be subtle. That beige really brought that highlight where we wanted it. And XV88 is then used to re-highlight the the pouches and the leather straps. So yeah, the straps as well. I'm half asleep, guys. It's like Friday afternoon. I've been working on this thing all week for you. And we're almost finished at this point. So lead belcher is then used to re-highlight the blade. Sort of a feathering motion towards the raised areas, because I didn't want it to look clean like you would on, say, grey knights or something. It'd be quite chipped and dirty, so I didn't mind leaving some markings in there as long as they don't look like brush strokes. So feathering stuff out works quite well for this, to sort of age the metal. Then steel by Model Air Metallic is used to just sharpen up those edges even further, give them a nice sharp point so it stands out a bit all across those top edges. And after this colour, there's no more colours, which means we've finally made it to the end of the video. So there you go, guys, that's one Snakebite themed Weird Boy or Ork Shaman, depending on what game you're playing. Really cool fig, a bit difficult to paint due to the shape and everything. I did add an oil wash to the ropes. I added an oil wash to the bits where the ropes meet the stones, stuff that needed a little bit more depth. But you don't want to oil wash any of the cloak because you'll ruin all that detail and all that shading that you've done with the hard black line, and that just doesn't work. And of course, a special thank you to all our patrons who help support this channel. We appreciate that a lot, especially these two. That's Ludwig Holfbohr and Robert Paints Models. I hope I didn't butcher your name there. And the link for our Patreon is down below in the description, as well as our eBay and Facebook. Join us on Patreon to get early access to some of our tutorials. They've already got loads of stuff up there, as well as competition entries and loads of other cool stuff. Don't forget, check out the Outpost affiliate link as well, and bookmark that so you can go there, get discount games and discount brushes, paints, all that lot. And it's all brand new off the shelf, so that's our new affiliate link, so you'll be seeing those a lot. And don't forget guys, hit subscribe, hit like, always share with your friends on Facebook because that helps us out loads. And of course, we'll catch you in the next one. This has been a really long video and a long week, so I think I'm just going to crawl into bed and sleep for the rest of the weekend. Thanks for watching guys, we'll catch you in the next one.